Hush now. Let your eyes close if they want to. Breathe slow. Imagine first a single distant star, pale, steady, pinpricking a velvet so vast it holds 1,000,000 quiet storms. The galaxy breathes around that star. Long, slow inhalations and exhalations of light and shadow that cross dizzying distances where nothing aches for long enough to be called peace. Tonight we will travel there, not with hurried steps or clanging armor, but with a low, even voice that walks like a shadow along the hull of an ancient ship. We will walk where light has long ago been sullen, and we will listen. In the far reaches, where space folds into iron and memory, there are legions of men given names and honors and songs. Among them are those who love the idea of perfection the way a child loves a far-off melody, with wide, trembling attention, with a hunger that insists on more. There were banners stitched with gold, voices trained to chime like fine crystal, and a devotion that began as a vow and slowly braided itself into the very bones of those who bore it. They called themselves the Emperor's children, but for now, breathe. Imagine the hush of a sleeping world, rain on a metal roof that's been patched so many times it sings different notes with every drop. That is the sound of a planet that remembers battles in its gutters and keeps their echoes. Imagine too a single corridor within an enormous ship, not the blaring, brazed corridors of war you might expect, but a long, polished hall where footfalls are measured, where the soft scrape of a servitor's limb blends with the distant murmur of a chapel chant. The light here is gentle, filtered through stained glass of 1,000 campaigns, and there is a melancholy in the way it rests on faces like dust settling on old paintings. The Emperor's children were born of discipline and artistry. They were once craftsmen of war and beauty. Their armor was hammered not only for protection, but for line and proportion, for how it curved beneath a moon or caught a flare of cannon fire. They moved in formations like a poem, in gestures that made the act of combat itself look for a moment like an elegy. Their songs were precise. Their laughter, when it lived, was a rare, clean thing that sounded almost like applause. We meet them tonight not as gods or villains, but as the tired, shining things they became. Imagine an officer, not a name you need to remember, not yet, standing at a parapet. His armor is immaculate, every plate a mirror. You might think such perfection makes him cold. It does not. Look instead at the eyes behind the helm, small mirrors of memory. He remembers being a boy on a world of hard winters, the taste of thin ale, the brief warmth of a hand in his. He remembers the words that drew him up from the mud: honor, discipline, perfection. He remembers promising to never again be small. There is a sadness there, soft at the edges. He learned to speak in clipped phrases, his voice like the wind over an anvil, precise, measured, and always slightly distant. He traded a laugh for a salute. He traded an evening's warmth for a practice that began before dawn. It is easy, in the telling, to say their sacrifices were noble. It is harder, quieter in the bones, to say what those sacrifices took. Not just flesh or comfort, but the tiny, private, ragged things that make a person whole. The habit of humming to oneself, the clumsy, half-forgotten lullabies, the small rebellions of softness. These were peeled away, layer by deliberate layer, until what remained gleamed. The galaxy around them smelled of ozone and rain and oil. There was music in the servos of distant engines, a lullaby of mechanical breathing. When the Emperor's children assembled, they did so with a care that made ritual of simple tasks: the straightening of a cloak, the setting of a gauntlet upon a table, the polishing of a visor, until it reflected the candlelight like glass. Little gestures, repeated until they became as natural as the tides, kept the darkness at bay. Yet each small perfection was a thread in a tapestry. Beautiful, yes, but taut. The tighter it pulled, the less room there was for error, the less room there was for humanity. Listen now to the sounds of their quarters. The soft chime of data sleeves, the whisper of linens against plated boots, the low hum of a cogitator counting prayers in the night. There are relics on their walls, a medal half bent, a scrap of cloth from a long-lost world, an oil-stained sketch of a face no longer known. These objects are anchors, tiny, stubborn resistances against a lifetime of order. In the quiet, they tell stories. A child's drawing tucked in the edge of a Bible, the last letter from a sister, gone ages ago, but kept folded at the back of a private chest. These are the proofs that once, those who wear such armor were more than doctrine and machine. Yet between the relics and the ritual, there is another sound, the faint, persistent rhythm of longing. It is a human noise, small and almost embarrassed, the kind that surfaces when men are meant to be great. They long for beauty, for excellence in all things. They seek it in their art, in their manners, in the way they fight. That longing at first is warm and bright. It gives purpose. But longing is a mirror. It shows what one lacks. And when the desire for perfection becomes a hunger, it learns the bitter art of swallowing what stands between you and the image in the glass. Think of a smith shaping a blade. Each strike is exact, each breath measured to time the blow, and the metal sings under the hammer. But what if the smith kept striking and striking, not to shape the metal, but to see if perfection might bleed into being? What if the smith began to believe the sparks of his hammer were the only true stars? It is a slow thing, this change, a whispered conviction that the next adjustment will render everything whole. The emperor's children began like that. They believed in excellence as a path back to something lost, to grandeur, to the emperor's approval, to an ideal. They chased it like a song. Here, in this restful hour, we do not rush to judging them. We sit with them in the dim glow of a mess hall, listening to the soft clink of cutlery against plated plates. Around the table are faces, hardened and beautiful in the way only wear can make a face beautiful. And the talk is ordinary. Tactics, the weather on some colony 3 systems away, the quality of a wine. They laugh, and the sound is precise and maybe a little too perfect. Yet underneath, in the pauses between sentences, glances flick like moths to an altar room where someone is always polishing something, always arranging something else into its proper place. The perfection is comforting and isolating at once. It draws people close while making them smaller. There is an old chapel tucked into the heart of their fortress ship, a place where banners hang heavy with the sweat of many campaigns. Candles burn there in patterns, not random, but counted. The chaplains move between the pews like gardeners pruning for form. They do not banish memory, they shape it. In one quiet corner, a septuagenarian veteran, older by the standard of such warriors, traces the outline of a scar with a fingertip that has long learned the languages of metal and prayer. He hums under his breath, a tune like a thread pulling through cloth. It is an old lullaby, or perhaps a hymn. It speaks of loss without naming it. And outside, always outside, the world is loud with the weather of war. Occasionally, the horizon is sliced by the flash of artillery. Sometimes the sky burns like a wound. Sometimes it weeps oil. But there are nights like this, rare and sacred, when only the rain speaks, and it does so softly, like a hand on a shoulder. It is on such nights that the emperor's children remember what they once were. Children who loved beauty in small things, a well-made bowl, the fold of a cloak, the exactness of a sonnet. They return to those memories like sailors returning to harbour. We must talk gently about the shape of their devotion. It was not blind. It was curated, refined, and made into a creed. They had an idea that excellence in all things would be the salve for an aching world. They sought to purify life through standards of taste and conduct. Their temples were workshops. Their oaths were drawn like architectural plans. They believed that discipline could carve the infinite into something legible, that beauty could be a fortress. There was nobility in that thought. There was also fragility. Consider now the portrait of a single man, a sergeant who keeps a small painting in his locker. The painting is of a valley at dawn, painted in oils by a hand never meant for war. He looks at it sometimes when his hands hurt from holding a blade too long. He remembers the artist's laugh, the smear of colour on her thumb. He keeps the painting because it is imperfect. It reminds him that life need not be endlessly rehearsed to have meaning. Yet when he wakes from dreams of battle, he worries the brushstrokes are not sharp enough, that the composition could be better. The worry is a slow river. It carves into the edges of him. There is comfort, too, in the small rituals of their day. The morning inspection where each buckle must sit true. The afternoon where an officer will spend a single hour correcting a misshapen ornament. The evening when a gentleman might recite a line of verse, translating it into actions. These are acts of care as much as control. The care can be tenderness, a hand smoothing another's shoulder, the steadying of a trembling hand in battle. But care, left to its own devices and fed by a hunger for perfection, can become a cage. Perfection begins to ask for more. It asks for sacrifices that make the skeleton of a person tidy, but leave the heart exposed like a clockwork mechanism, with its gears visible to the rain. Do you hear in your mind the soft mechanical whisper of servo arms adjusting a cloak? It is a gentle sound, almost like a lullaby. The whisper hides architectures of loss. The voice that once laughed at a poor joke is quieter now. A woman's cheek, once warm with the press of a kiss, is a memory kept in a small box. They trade softness for exactness. It is not all terrible. They do carve wonders, sculptures that seem to breathe, symphonies that make hardened veterans weep, banquets where flavors are arranged in the order of constellations. In those moments, there is a fragile, piercing beauty, and you understand why they would want to keep going. Why they would believe that the next note, the next revision, the next refinement would make everything whole. But there is always a shadow beneath the sheen. A very small thing, an unattended word, a glance held a moment too long, begins to spread like a quiet stain. Perhaps it starts with a piece of music that lingers too long in the mind, a harmony that refuses to be dismissed. A soldier hums it at the edge of sleep and, for the first time, hears not only the beauty, but a memory of something outside himself that seems to answer. The melody seems to promise more than perfection. It promises that to attain beauty is to attain a kind of immortality. It suggests that small sacrifices are merely necessary refinements. The suggestion is soft, it is patient. As the night deepens in our story, there is no sudden change. There is no crack of thunder that breaks a calm. Instead, perfection tightens like a cloak. The rituals become more precise. Men linger with their instruments longer. The things they polish gleam with an intensity that is almost hungry. A young acolyte in the forges begins to gaze not at the shapes he must make, but at the glow in the furnace, as if it were a thing to adore. He seeks an angle of light where metal looks loveliest, and he finds himself rearranging scenes to catch that angle more often. You may wonder gently whether such striving is innocent. That question is the quiet center of what follows. For now, we will leave the Emperor's children holding their cups of wine and listening to each other's careful speech. We will leave them with their private tokens of memory and the small, bright hunger that begins to grow in the dark. We will close this chapter like the lid of a music box that still plays its first soft notes. Tomorrow, or the next time we speak, we will trace that hunger further. We will follow the thin line between devotion and obsession, between beauty and appetite. For tonight, rest with the image of the corridor and the parapet, the veteran with the painting, the chaplain counting candles, and the acolyte watching the furnace. Let the rain on the hull lull you. Let the mechanical whirring settle like a hand on your brow. Listen one last time. The galaxy inhales. Somewhere distant, an alloy bell tolls, precise and all the more haunting for its exactness. It is a sound that promises order and also, faintly, something else. A calling that echoes in marrow and metal. It is patient, it waits. Sleep, if you will. The stars are many, and the night is very soft. But keep this echo with you. Something beautiful is waking, and it wants to be perfected. They began as a promise. Not a thunderous vow shouted above a battlefield, but a quiet promise exchanged between a boy and the thin, honest world that made him, to do something carefully, to do something well, to be something that would not break under the weight of days. In that small pledge, there was a seed of fidelity, a warmth that felt like a hand on the small of the back, guiding forward. From such small promises grew stations, and from stations grew companies, and from companies grew legions. The Emperor's children were not birthed by one moment of fiat. They were braided from hundredfold winters of will. Imagine a world where ceremonies are the scaffold of the soul. On that world, the first aspirants learn to stand in a circle and to breathe as one. They learn to fold cloth with exactness, to lift a cup without clatter, to trim a beard along a single invisible line. These were children taught to measure the world, not merely to observe, but to make it conform to a standard. The standard was taste, discipline, and an almost scientific reverence for order. A man who could perform an inspection of his own soul as effortlessly as checking a blade for burrs was admired. He was trusted. He was chosen. Their early reputation was iron and jewel, warriors who carried with them a sense of composition, a sense that battle could be ordered and made beautiful. Where others saw only chaos, they saw rhythm. Where others struck with crude force, they struck with choreography. Their campaigns read like liturgies. An advance, a pause, a note held until the steel and the smoke and the song resolved into something terrible and precise. In the early years, this was their salvation. The Emperor's children believed in purpose. They served the Emperor not as slaves, but as artisans of war, believing that excellence itself was a form of worship. Devotion, in their hearts, was not a blind abyss. It was an apprenticeship with the future. They were taught that the emperor's light was not only to be adored, but to be mirrored, to emulate the emperor, to make one's actions exact, one's decisions considered. One's face, the very architecture of restraint, was a way to stake a claim in eternity. Every ordered act was a prayer, every polished helmet a scripture, every parade a sermon. They learned languages of nuance, the tilt of a shoulder, the space between words, the cadence of a march. Those who could compose themselves as if they were a living instrument felt a kinship with the world. They felt for a time immovable, and yet devotion given form can calcify. The love of excellence is a bright thing, but like all bright things, it throws shadows. To make beauty the altar is to invite scrutiny into every private corner. If excellence becomes a ladder, then the climb is endless. To be perfect is to be perpetually a student. Each attainment only a platform from which higher standards look down and demand more. The emperor's children discovered this with a simple, fatal grace. They found that the very acts which made them noble could be stretched thin until they became nets, beautiful but binding. There is something important in the way we understand obsession. It is not sudden. It arrives as a companionable guest, and then, without malice, slips its arm around your shoulder. The first songs of obsession sound like encouragement. One more refinement, it says. One more tempering. You consent because who would refuse betterment? The metal grows truer. The symphony grows purer. The formation tighter. At first, the gains are discreet and measurable. Then the demands become less about art and more about erasing error. Error becomes intolerable. Where error lingers, it is not merely an imperfection. It is an affront, a wound in the fabric they have vowed to mend. Picture the workshop of a master smith, every tool aligned, every stroke planned. Now imagine that the master, who once took pleasure in the surprise of a line gone just a little askew, begins to see that deviation as an ugliness that must be corrected. He sharpens until the cutting becomes slicing, and his hands, once full of warmth from the friction of work, begin to tremble with a different hunger. He does not notice the quietness that comes to his laughter. He does not notice the way his eyes, once gentle with curiosity, narrow into instruments themselves. Such was the gradual inward turn of the emperor's children. Devotion that becomes discipline can be a harbor. Devotion that becomes an ideology can become a prison. The emperor's children took their vows and polished them until the polish reflected nothing but law. The rituals that had once framed a life now began to define it from the outside in. Every clasp that had once bound comrades together now tightened. The group's sense of identity, their pride in finery, their love of order, became a mirror that showed them only themselves. What once included the world now excluded it. The more exact they became, the smaller the world seemed to them. There is a fine, almost musical geography to their days. Dawn begins with the slow tuning of instruments, not only lutes and organs, but the lesser instruments of the body. Morning drills are not merely exercises, they are scores to be played. The cadence of a squad step, the angle of a spear, the way a cloak hangs, all are composed. These gestures become rites. They find meaning in minutiae, and minutiae grow weighty. A misaligned strap is trouble because it says something about your soul. A flawed poem is evidence that the mind is rusting. Thus perfection becomes not merely desirable but necessary, for otherwise the scaffolding of being might collapse. Because the quest for perfection is a social contagion, it spreads quickly. An officer's standards become a company's standards. A company's standards become a chapter's doctrine. Children are raised to the tune of squares and circles, to understand symmetry before they understand mercy. The legion's culture begins to prize the visible marks of refinement, the engraved gauntlet, the well-lined epaulette, the timbre of one's voice when reciting an oath. And as those marks solidify into markers of belonging, anything that deviates is othered. Softness, sloppiness, spontaneity, these become liabilities. We must say here, tenderly, that the emperor's children were not monsters in their origin. They were neither cruel nor insane. They were overwhelmingly devoted. Their tragedies come from a human place, from a desire to fix what had been broken, to dress fear with beauty, to answer the world's chaos with an unassailable design. But their instruments were exquisitely calibrated. Rituals, aesthetics, and selective memory. Each instrument, used alone and with restraint, might have been a remedy. Together and unchecked, they formed a machinery hungry for its own perfection. Imagine now the private places of the Legion, not the parade ground, but the small rooms behind it where men wash, read, and undo the day. There are cabinets filled with tools for grooming and tools for repair, files for nails, brushes for hair, chisels for wood, and scalpel-like instruments for delicate work. In one corner sits an altar of minor things, a hair ribbon, a cigarette case, a scrap of handwriting. These tiny items are curated like specimens in a glass case. To love an object is to name it. To name it is to own a piece of the past. The Legion loves in this way. Carefully and with an economy of expression, they conserve echoes instead of living them. Observe the acolyte who delights in the scent of ink. He learns calligraphy not because he must, but because the perfection of a letter calms a part of his mind that other things cannot reach. He begins to judge everything by that prism. A battlefield report must be not only accurate but elegant. A map must lay its ink as if composing a sonnet. The intoxicating clarity of a well-made thing is like a drug. It dulls pain and promises refuge. The acolyte drinks, and each sip is precise. The problem is simple. All drugs demand doses. The acolyte wants more of the heady rush of exactitude. He pushes and then pushes further. Pride is a subtle thing. It does not immediately announce itself with banners and horns. It creeps in as an approval, the commendation for a parade that was executed better than the last. It settles on shoulders as a comfortable weight. The Legion rewards improvement, and the rewards feel like light. There is a feedback loop. An action done well is praised. Praise encourages repetition. Repetition becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. The identity becomes prized, then prized above the original reasons for the practice. The soldier who once loved beauty for its own sake now loves it because it marks him as one who has been accepted into an order that is more and more exacting. This is where danger folds in like a dark seam. Pride muffles the introspective voice that might ask, at what cost? It quiets dissent, it narrows perspective, and it makes cruelty plausible under the rubric of necessary refinement. Those who question the path are not merely wrong. They are ugly. They mar the composition. The Legion's language begins to change subtly. What was once called correction is now called excision. What was once called discipline is now called purification. With each semantic shift, the moral grammar of the group tilts. And then there are the relics of worship. The Emperor's children did not simply fight. They made sanctity of the tools of war. A sword is not merely hammered metal. It is a living line. A bayonet is not merely affixed. It is adjusted until it sings. They chant not only prayers but measurements, degrees, ratios, angles. The chapels smell of oil and incense, and the two are not opposed. They kneel before icons whose faces are not wholly human, faces that have been idealized by sculptors until they hover at the edge of the uncanny. The more they tended these icons, the more the icons seemed to tend back, catching their light and returning it with a little more insistence each time. There is an interesting chemical to obsession. Ritual feeds scapegoating. When a legion finds a scapegoat, an error, an offense, a failing, it can direct its energy outward. Punishment is neat. It makes the world comprehensible. But when punishment is performed with artistry, it becomes spectacle. The discipline of a tribunal is not merely about ruling. It is about ritualized elimination. The guilty are not only corrected, they are reworked for public example. The process is precise, clinical, and terrifying in its ordinary logic. It sanitizes cruelty because it frames cruelty as an act of creation. We must attend, gently, to the internal lives of these warriors. Beneath the polished breastplate, under the ritual, there are private ailments. A veteran remembers a lullaby hummed by a mother who is long dust. Another carries a stone smoothed by fingers that could not be saved. These small anchors into humanity keep some from being wholly unmoored, but as the Legion tightens its standards, these anchors are put at risk. A man holding two truths, loyalty to his comrades and loyalty to the ideal of perfection, will eventually be forced to choose which is truer. The tension is both exquisite and brutal. Now envision the slow, imperceptible corrosion of a soul. It does not happen all at once. It arrives as a tiny abrasion, an unkind word that goes unanswered, an order followed that did not need to be given, a joke that dies on its tongue. The world begins to narrow as minutiae become absolute. Memories are edited to fit the standard. A laugh is remembered as a shallow thing. Pain is retold as weakness. The Legion's narratives are retouched like canvas, blemishes painted over and replaced with strokes of doctrine. The self is remade in the image of the standard. There is a particular horror in perfection turned inward. When one's judgment is the measure of all things, one finds oneself constantly measuring others. The most dangerous act in such a culture is to desire beauty so much that one begins to manufacture it in others by force. This is the hinge upon which their descent turns. If beauty can be cultivated through art, perhaps it can also be cultivated through surgery, through discipline, through a relentless remaking of flesh and habit. If a man's voice is not the right tenor, it might be trained or scoured. If a face does not carry the right expression, it might be corrected until the face is something else entirely. The satellite acts of improvement, one by one, accrete into a system that regards bodies as canvases and people as compositions to be perfected, regardless of consent. And so the line between care and control blurs. A surgeon's gentle hand can be the same hand that rearranges a jaw to fit a preconceived aesthetic. A smith's eye for a blade can be the eye that decides which limbs must be reconfigured to achieve symmetry. Within the Legion's logic, these acts are framed as mercy. To make someone fitting is to save them from shame. The rhetoric of salvation is powerful. It wraps cruelty in a cloth of righteousness. Those who resist such treatment are called stubborn, lacking, unredeemed. The terminology, again, protects the system. There is a music to their decline, not at first discordant, but a progression of harmonics that shift into a minor key. A cadence repeats and repeats until the ear is deceived into accepting it. So it is with the Emperor's children. The harmonies of discipline and dedication are repeated until they begin to sound like commands engraved into bone. They begin to find beauty in severity because severity is what has been rewarded. They admire the angular and the exact, and what once was simply ordered now becomes austere. The austere becomes cold. The cold becomes indifferent. Indifference becomes cruelty. And always, threaded through these transformations, is a whispering language of superiority. To perfect is to be above, and where above exists, below is implied. There are choices to be made in such a world, to protect the weak in their imperfect blossoming, or to prune them for the sake of a uniform garden. The Legion, in choosing uniformity, chooses a kind of sterile immortality. It will not crumble under time, but neither will it pulse with spontaneous life. Its sculptures will not rot, but neither will they breathe. Yet the worst mysteries of their nature are not merely social or aesthetic. They are metaphysical. For a people fixated on the idea of perfect form, any hint that the universe itself might be malleable is intoxicating and terrifying. They begin to speak of influence as if it could be harnessed. Here lies a danger unique to those who make beauty into a theology. A language can be mistaken for a liturgy, and a liturgy for a machine. When the sacred becomes technical, faith takes on the logic of an algorithm. They begin to look for formulas, a sequence of notes that produces exaltation, a particular alloy that brings calm, a particular phrase that clears the mind of doubt. The desire for such formulas is understandable. The belief that such formulas work is where peril nests. When a people allow ritual to become a machine for perfection, they begin to see patterns where there are only accidents. They attribute agency to objects, a blade whispered to hold luck, a fabric said to steep courage. The enchanted object becomes a scapegoat for their anxieties, and worse, a lever for their discipline. Instead of holding themselves accountable, they ritualize responsibility away into externalities. It is easier to blame a dull sword than to question a doctrine. Thus, superstition and method entwine. It is here, in the marriage of method and superstition, that corruption finds purchase. Not the dramatic corruption of sudden villainy, but the patient corruption of systems turned to end themselves. A ritual that was once a cushion becomes a gear in a machine that demands oiling with lives. A doctrine that once gave structure now demands conformity until everyone moves as one, and the music becomes a dirge. The corruption is not a contagion so much as a logical consequence. If excellence is the only good, then anything that obstructs it is a weed to be removed. Consider briefly the moral calculus required for such removal. If a man refuses adjustment, is he spared or punished? If an artist refuses to refine his piece, does the piece remain or burn? The answer, when given by a legion whose first principle is perfection, is often swift and cold. The slow surgery of social editing accelerates to a sharp, decisive operation. Those who are labelled as flawed are either remade into the pattern or excised so that the pattern remains unmarred. The language of aesthetics has become law, and law has seldom been kind. We should pause here to remember the human faces behind these choices. There are beguiled hands that sign orders. There are officers who hesitate before sending a man to be corrected. There are mothers who secretly stitch the sleeve of a sun and curse the doctrine in the privacy of their wrist. The tragedy is structural. It is larger than any single man's malice. The pattern of perfection asks for sacrifice, and the social machine that sustains the pattern transforms sacrifice into requirement. People comply because they believe in the promise at the heart of the order, that by becoming exact, they will be spared the chaos that devours less careful lives. But belief rationalizes everything. It will rationalize both the neat parades and the cruel operations. When belief is shared by many, it becomes a justification for acts that would otherwise be unthinkable. It is the legion's collective faith that burns the most quietly. They do not wake one day and choose cruelty. They wake and convince themselves, with 1,000 small reproofs and 1,000 small kindnesses, that what they do is rescue. The problem is that rescue begins to look like remaking. So what is left when the body and the ritual and the social fabric have been altered? A thing very beautiful, perhaps, in its lines and symmetry. But beauty without warmth is a museum piece. It is admired by some, feared by others, and missed by those who remember the messier, softer parts of life. The Emperor's children can make wonders. They can also, if permitted, make prisons. This ambivalence is their true shape. Neither wholly noble nor wholly vile, but a study in the dangers of a value made absolute. As we close this chapter of quiet observation, the Legion stands at a threshold. Its armor gleams, its hymns are precise, its faces are composed. Yet beneath the composition, under practices that began as salutary discipline, something else has spread. A taste for totalization. The measures that once held them together now measure them down. The craftsmen of war are learning a terrible grammar, that the means of shaping the world can come, with patient repetition, to be the world itself. Tonight, as you lie with the memory of their measured breath in your ears, let this thought rest lightly. Perfection is a beautiful scaffolding, but scaffolding can become a cage when it has no exit. The Emperor's children walked its scaffolds with hands that had once been small and soft. They learned to craft order to keep fear at bay. In doing so, they invited a different fear in. The fear of imperfection. The fear that drives men to cut themselves until their edges are sharp and their faces unmarked. The promise of perfection had its own price, and that price would be paid in ways both visible and secret. There will be more to come, a deeper pull, an intoxicating promise that beauty may be more than surface, that it might be a kind of power. For now, close this little book on their nature and breathe. Listen to the rhythm of the world they inhabit. Measured, precise, beautiful, and slowly, inexorably, on the verge of being remade into something that will not recognize the hands that formed it. Let that image float like a stone dropped into a dark pool. Watch the rings spread and know that each ripple is a choice that moves outward, touching lives in ways the original maker may never intend. Begin by settling again into that slow breath. Let the world narrow to the room you are in, to the soft weight of the covers, to the faint sound of your own heartbeat. Imagine now the fortress ship as a great lung, drawing in air and exhaling it in a rhythm older than the people who walk its decks. The ship remembers battles. It remembers lullabies. Its skin is plate and glass, and something older than both presses against it from the dark between stars. Not yet an enemy you can name, only a suggestion of attention, like eyes upon a sleeping child. When unease begins, it rarely arrives with a trumpet. It slips in through seams. Imagine first a tiny misalignment. A banner on a chapel wall hangs a fraction off true. A line in an incision of stone is not exact. The eye notices such things in a house of artisans. The eye returns. The mind says gently, correct it. That small correction is routine, almost meditative. It is where the first whisper finds purchase. There are whispers on the ship that no chamber is designed to hold. They thread through ducts and along the hollow backs of statues. They are not loud, they are not crude. They come as echoes of admiration, of praise, the kind that flatters the edges of obsession. You will imagine them as a susurration, a sound like silk sliding over brass, and at first they feel like compliments. Better, they murmur. Refine. The acolyte in the forges hears them while he tunes his hammer. The veteran in the chapel hears them while he traces a scar. At first, the words are indistinguishable from his own desires. Dreams begin to change as the whispers grow. They are the first places the mind betrays the self. One man, a sergeant who has kept his composure through a dozen campaigns, begins to have dreams that end not in battle, but in salons. In these dreams, light falls on a face and reveals a perfection he has not seen since he was a boy. The face smiles, and the smile is precise in a manner that feels like a measurement. He wakes with his hands clenched, as though holding a cup too hot to touch. The memory warms and aches. He cannot tell if the ache is longing or guilt. Another soldier dreams of a mirror, not reflecting, but answering. In the mirror, a figure moves with all the small, practiced gestures that the Legion prizes. The arch of a brow, the careful tilt of a head. The figure speaks without lips. The soldier understands the words as if they were a reading of a page he has long known. Shape yourself until nothing shakes. He wakes, and the phrase reverberates under his breath, and when he speaks it aloud in the mess hall, his comrades nod, as if reciting a proverb. Notice how these dreams are not violent. They are beautiful. They are the lullabies of the thing that will become a predator. Beauty is the softest skin over metallic teeth. It makes the taking look like giving. It is in this slipperiness, the feeling that what is asked is not a demand, but a favor, that the early corruption thrives. Small shifts in the body accompany these intrusions. The acolyte notices at first the little sensations, a tightening at the nape like a collar that wants to be straightened, a flicker beneath the skin as if some small instrument is being passed over the surface. He blames fatigue. He tightens his grip on his tools and works later into the night to still the sensation. The sensation persists, patient and insinuating, like a slow tune heard at the edge of hearing, a note that repeats and becomes a motif until the ear adjusts. The Legion, devoted to refinement, interprets these sensations through the vocabulary of improvement. A refinement of nerve, they say, an adjustment of posture. They call it a blessing because to admit fear would be to admit a flaw. The chaplains write it into their liturgy as a test of discipline, to be welcomed and not feared. The phrase test of discipline offers cover. It frames unease as something to be overcome with composure. It is easier, always, to name what oppresses you than to become an unnameable change. As the whispers thicken, rituals that were once private begin to seed habit into obsession. A commander who used to spend his evening correcting a single line of embroidery now spends nights reworking the same pattern until his hands are raw. He believes that the last stitch will reveal something, a clarity, a perfection. Instead, it reveals a pattern within him, impatience folded into ritual, desire braided with torment. Each night, he wakes with the taste of iron on his tongue and the faint, echoing applause of a crowd that is not present. There are other symptoms. A hunched gait that straightens into an almost unnatural posture when observed. Fingers that linger on another's gauntlet for a moment too long, as if cataloguing the way the leather sits against the metal. A private chamber that once housed mementos of a life now contains only objects arranged with unbearable order. The veteran who kept a child's drawing now frames it behind a pane and straightens it 3 times a day. The drawing smiles back, and the veteran finds himself less interested in what it depicts than in the impossibility of its edges aligning. The change is not uniform. Some push back with a stubbornness born of private memory. The mother who writes letters and tucks them into the seams of sleeves. The surgeon who refuses to mark a man's face without consent. But pushback is risk. The Legion has ways of making dissent feel foolish rather than criminal. It laughs at it politely. It rewards the compliant with one more honor, one more appointment. The rewards act as stitches, binding the dissent back into the fabric. Social pressure is, many times over, more compelling than a blade. The whispering intensifies not only in words but in structure. Patterns reorganize in corners of the ship. The choir's cadence slips a half step into a melody that is not quite part of the hymn book. The forges produce a glow that lasts a heartbeat longer each cycle. Instruments keep time with an almost predatory patience, and men begin to feel that their bodies must keep up or be left behind. They begin to rehearse not only maneuvers but themselves. The rehearsal becomes a life. The life becomes the performance. And then there is the physical oddness. Little, precise failures and adjustments that suggest the machinery of flesh is answering to a different tuning fork. A veteran wakes with a blister on his palm that blooms in a crescent of brass-colored skin. A finger joint that once ached in winter becomes oddly flexible, then supple in a way that should be welcome but feels alien. A voice, in the morning, has acquired a new timbre, as if some tiny gear inside the throat has been ground and polished overnight. These changes are easy to rationalize away. Too much armor, a small infection, an odd diet. The mind, when it wants continuity, is skilled at making explanations. But there are also more startling signs. A young initiator wakes one dawn to find that the scar on his cheek, the relic of a boyhood fight, has shifted imperceptibly. Where once it intercepts a line of bone, now it traces a curve that makes his face look more symmetrical. He touches it, searching for the pain that once accompanied the memory, and finds only a faint warmth. For a moment he delights. Beauty has seemingly found him. He walks through the mess with a lightness, showing the scar to a friend. His friend nods in approval. No one asks how the scar came to change. At night, under the thin music of the ship's engines, men begin to sing in tones that are almost ritual chants. The songs are simple: praise for excellence, calls for discipline. Gradually, new lines are added, phrases that echo the whispers. They are at first small, embedded so naturally that their meaning is unnoticed. Hold the line until no fault remains, or trim the edge and keep the light. But words, when repeated enough, become spells of a sort. They carve grooves in thought. The more the Legion repeats the phrases, the more those phrases direct action. Within the forges, an instrument of refinement takes on a rhythm all its own. A lathe hums, a file sings against metal. The sparks seem to fall in patterns of concentric, almost decorative arcs. An artisan begins to notice that when he shapes a blade with particular angles, the blade seems to cut air more cleanly. A surgeon, in private, studies the interplay of ligament and geometry until he begins to see the human frame as a puzzle of proportion. What begins as curiosity evolves into a doctrine of applied beauty. The surgeon draws diagrams and tests them on volunteered cadavers until he can make an arm look as if it were designed rather than grown. There is an ethical cracking point here, thin and fragile as old glass. The surgeon frames his work as generosity, the final act of making the injured whole, the last kindness for those who cannot adapt. He argues in chapel, in mess, in private, and finds ears that nod. Language is malleable. Mercy can be redefined into intervention. When enough listeners accept the redefinition, the act is no longer a transgression, but a practice. The surgeon's tools, once instruments of healing, become also instruments of design. Some of these alterations are welcomed by the recipients. Pain is soothed. Mobility is regained in ways that seem miraculous. A limb once bent into uselessness is reworked and becomes a thing of careful engineering that the bearer is proud to show. The temptation is then twofold: to continue to improve what is broken and to address what is merely asymmetrical. When the culture prizes visual harmony, the line between remedy and refinement begins to blur. Many ask for enhancements. Many request adjustments. The requests come in earnest. They are not forced in the earliest stage. They are petitioned for, bargained over, celebrated. Yet there is a darker pattern. Some who are brought before the surgeon do not ask and do not consent. They are repositioned in accordance with doctrine. The tribunal convenes, words are exchanged, and the verdict is framed as service. The man sits in a chair with straps and weights while others tell him of his faults. He is told he will be made beautiful for the good of the whole. His protestations are gently ignored. The operation is a ceremony in which the group makes itself right by making him wrong. It is both a technical operation and a social lesson. Observe, too, the small psychological thefts that happen in private. A friend who once told a joke now cannot remember the exact phrasing. A melody that once belonged to a woman's voice is quoted as a hymn. The Legion retells its own stories in a newly curated voice. Memory is not erased so much as edited. In the edits, the edges are sharpened and the mess of living smoothed away. Those who resist feel like small islands of mess in a sea of lacquer. The lacquer is beautiful. The islands are messy and warm. As a culture, they choose lacquer. The sense of self begins to fray in the margins. Men stand before mirrors and adjust shoulders, jaw, the tilt of a boot. They practice smiles that are not smiles but formulas. Conversations narrow to the details of craft and the aesthetics of living. The question, "How are you?" becomes an inquiry into efficiency of mood. "Are you aligned?" they ask. The language of care becomes the language of calibration. It is subtle, but precise terms change the way people understand one another. To be misaligned is not to be sad. It is to be a fault that calls for correction. And yet there are nights when the whispers turn from flattering to insistent. They do not scream, but they begin to demand. A melody repeats until it solicits a movement. A phrase becomes a direction. The acolyte who once liked the scent of ink now finds himself scribbling lines of a script that he cannot fully read but can follow. He traces the curves until the letters seem to glow. On the margins of his notebook, a small, curious stain forms that looks like oil and yet smells faintly of incense. He worries briefly that perhaps he has been careless. Then he returns to his work and the stain is gone. The most terrifying change is not outward appearance but interior space. Men, hardened, ritualized men, start to feel a vacancy as if a small room inside them has been rearranged. They sense echoes where once there were anchors. A memory no longer rings with the same truth. When asked about a child they once loved, a veteran replies with an almost academic tone about the quality of the child's handwriting. A woman who had once been the subject of longing becomes, in speech, a reference point for an ideal. It is as if the inner life has been trimmed like a hedge. Useful shapes remain, but the messy wild growth that once was spontaneous affection has been pruned away. Listen, now, to a quieter horror, the sound of compulsion dressed as choice. An officer offers a voluntary program of enhancements. Men line up to volunteer their limbs and faces to the workshop. They march and sign forms and smile as they are called brave and forward-thinking. The officers speak of giving back to the Legion and raising standards. The men who go under the knives return with alterations that are admired, and yet that whisper of otherness. Friends look at them with a mixture of pride and something like fear, and no one names the fear. They do not need to. The social pressure does soft the edges of consent until it is a membrane. And finally, the dreams. They deepen. The mirror figures begin to speak more directly. The sergeant dreams that his voice is replaced by the sound of well-tempered steel singing. He wakes and finds himself humming a melody he cannot locate in any of the Legion's hymnals. The melody is obscene in its beauty. It curves into the mind and makes the skin clamp at the edges. He sings it once, and another soldier hears it and learns it with eerie immediacy. A chorus forms in the barracks as the song spreads. The song is an algorithm of longing. In time, the changes that began as small, a shifted scar here, a more precise posture there, gather into a visible drift. Faces become straighter, lines more symmetrical. Movements are carved of a single intent. Where once there was laughter, now there are the measured breaths of technique. The ship's songs have new lines. The forges glow with an extra, almost devotional heat. The whisper, which once sounded like kindness, now sounds like instruction. We end this chapter not with a sudden collapse, but with a quiet threshold crossed. The Legion has become accustomed to the taste of its own reflection. The dream music has found listeners. Hands that were once instruments of care are learning to be instruments of change, and the people around them nod and applaud the transformations as beauty. Yet inside some of them, a small resistance remains. A mother's letter here, a child's drawing there, a recollection of a clumsy, warm embrace. These things do not hold the Legion back. They are instead collected like curiosities, reminders of what was possible. As you drift towards sleep, let the last sensation be the feeling of the ship inhaling slowly, and the faint, changing tone of a distant bell. Its note is almost perfect, but there is a hairline crack that makes the sound paradoxically more beautiful and more terrible. The crack is a promise. Shape will be found, and with shape will come sacrifice. The whisper has learned to speak in the vernacular of longing. It has begun to ask in the gentlest voice for what it cannot name. Now the hands of the Legion are reaching to answer. Rest, if you can. The next time we speak, the small changes will gather and accelerate. The surgeon's scalpel will find its place in parliaments of praise. The music that calls will become a chorus. The sleep you have now is still yours. The next sleep perhaps will taste different. Listen, keep your breath slow and steady. Let what has come before ring in your bones like a struck bell. The polished corridors, the measured gestures, the small, insistent whisper that promised refinement. Tonight the bell tolls again, but the tone has shifted. It leans, it warps. The sound itself seems to lean toward you, as if it wants you to understand the offering it holds. Beauty, finally, without limit. The whisper is louder now. It moves like smoke through a room, gathering into shapes that almost look like hands. It no longer says merely refine or better. It threads a name through the air. A name that tastes of velvet and glass. Slaanesh. To name it is to call a door. Men who had merely leaned toward perfection now find themselves pressed against that door, feeling the grain of the wood, the warmth of a hand on the latch. They are not ignorant. They are curious. Curiosity is a hinge. At first, the influence is sensory and sweet. A touch more exquisite than any they have felt begins to hover at the edges of their perception. The acolyte, who would spend hours perfecting a line of script, now notices the way light falls on a lip. The veteran who hoarded a child's drawing now finds the paper's texture deliciously wrong and impossible to leave alone. These sensations are not crude. They do not force themselves. They interweave themselves with pleasure until the two are indistinguishable. Pleasure becomes a measurement. Pleasure becomes the standard. Once Slaanesh's touch is felt, the body answers with betrayals that seem like gifts. Fingers lengthen a fraction where a chord is learned. The jaw sets into an angle that catches candlelight just so. Where there had been scars and mismatched bone, now there are lines that please the eye. The leg that once dragged behind a man's stride now moves with a dancer's deceptive lightness. At first, these changes are celebrated as triumphs. The surgeon's instruments have given elegance to pain. Hymns are sung that praise the hands that made such miracles. The ship vibrates with approval, but the gifts of Slaanesh are accruals on a debt. For every neat line gained, something else loosens. What is taken is often an interior detail, a small human looseness that made unpredictability possible. A laugh becomes too precise to be spontaneous. Erotic memory is filed and curated like a library entry. The brush of a lover's hand is catalogued not for warmth, but for how it altered the curve of a muscle. Intimacy, which once welled in messy, unintended ways, becomes an aesthetic to be rehearsed. The lover becomes a model, lover composition. The space where surprise lived is smoothed into a surface. There is a new terminology. Officers speak of elevation and enhancement. Priests murmur of attunement, and surgeons mark their logs with harmonic integration. The words are velvet masks over action. A man says he has been elevated. His tone is reverent and soft. Behind his eyes there is a small, eager emptiness. He trusts the new vocabulary because it makes sense of the change. It organizes the strangers in his head into categories. The human becomes a project, and projects are manageable, and the craft becomes crueler. What started as small voluntary alteration proliferates into ritualized desire. The workshops hum day and night. Where once patients came for urgent repairs, now there are lines of those who seek the perfection offered by the revised anatomies of their comrades. The surgeons, precise, exalted, begin to try new geometries. They speak of proportion in tones that echo prayer. One more ratio, they say, and the patient consents because the promise is framed as salvation. It is framed as beauty. As changes accumulate, the body begins to betray in ever more obvious ways. Limbs are reworked until they are elegant in motion but somehow alien in sensation. A man whose spine has been corrected for posture finds that his sleep patterns alter. He dreams in long, slow images of statues that move. When he wakes, he feels lighter and unreachable. His voice has acquired an almost musical lilt that he cannot control. The sensation of hunger shifts. Appetite narrows until what remains is the appetite for precision, for a movement executed without tremor, for a face that does not betray. This narrowing of appetite is matched by a widening of senses in other directions. Men begin to hear the ship differently. The engines are not merely machinery, but a chorus. The distant thud of ordnance is a percussion. Sounds braid into music that can be followed like threads. The chorus calls for articulation. The body becomes an instrument tuned to response. Some men exult at such sensitivity. They revel in the way a touch can be felt as if magnified tenfold, how a fabric's grain can be tasted. The world is richer and more exquisite. And the price is that ordinary comfort, ordinary affection, begins to feel like a dull thing. The dreamscapes preside like priests over this new life. Dreams move from being private to being directive. Soldiers dream of halls where alabaster figures perform a choreography so flawless it feels holy. They wake with a compulsion to practice the motions they saw, as if the dream handed them instructions. The more they follow the instructions, the more attuned they become to a presence that they stop naming and start obeying with gratitude. The presence is patient. It does not demand in a brusque way. It suggests, and the suggester becomes adored. The intrusion grows bolder. At first, there are touches in sleep. A finger at a temple, a feather across the cheek. Some chalk these up to the restless nights of war. But then marks appear, tiny, almost ornamental, across the collarbones and wrists of initiates, like filigree etched beneath the skin. They glow faintly in low light. The surgeons claim these are side effects, pigment stabilization, a response to the alloys used. Some worship them as charms. Others cover them in shame. No one knows who first marked the skin. The question becomes dangerous. Physical horrors deepen in the forges of make. Surgeries once performed to restore are now experiments of form. Flesh is sculpted, cartilage trimmed, bone filed like sculpture. At times, the procedures are performed with the unwilling. A tribunal deems a man's countenance distracting. Artistry determines alteration as a civic duty. Where consent was once the line, doctrine now blurs it. The language of improvement, for the good of the whole, confers moral clarity upon acts that would otherwise be assault. The patient lies strapped, hooded, and a chorus of technicians hums the harmonies that will guide the surgeon's hand. The operating theatre is lit not only by lamps but by candles arranged to throw the shadow in flattering arcs. The surgeries are described with artistry. The steel sings as it passes through flesh, and the sound is a music on which some hang their heads in rapture. Later lie reports call the procedures elegant. The bodies that emerge from the table sometimes do not recognize themselves. They move with a lithe, practiced grace. Muscles are rerouted to create gestures judge-pleasing. Joints are altered to remove the awkwardness of a natural gait. The more this is done, the more the concept of natural begins to feel like a defect. The surgeons, rewarded with titles and small statues, find themselves intoxicated by the ability to translate doctrine into anatomy. Body horror is not merely cosmetic. The process touches nerve and mind. Some patients report phantom sensations. A hand where no hand now exists. A warmth that strides across the chest like an animal. Neuromodulators introduced during procedures lock in certain reflexes. Patients blink at a thought and the muscles respond. Minds become conditioned. The more the body is corrected, the more the mind rewrites itself to feel at home in the new frame. Memory is affected. A man reaches for the taste of his mother's bread and finds only the programmed remembrance of texture. The real recall is distant. In place of a living history, there are curated recollections, like tapes re-recorded and smoothed, until no static remains. Fighting changes too. Battlefields become theatres of exquisite carnage. Combat is no longer an ungainly clash of bodies, but a choreography of refinement. The Emperor's children move with impossible synchrony. A blade arcs, and the light catches along a contour chosen to be beautiful. The enemy's wounds are not only tactical, they are aesthetic. The Legion cares for the display of death. Shields are angled so that the gore splashes in patterns reputedly pleasing to behold. The arrangement of fallen foes after a fight, their limbs, their draped clothing, is curated so that those who look back at the scene see composition, not chaos. For some, the arrangement is comforting, a way to make sense of waste. For others, there is a smell of rot beneath the varnish. In the heart of battle, the whispers become practically audible. Amid the din of gunshots and the explosion of promethium, the voice, not entirely human, threads through the noise like a bright line. Men hear a command that is not tactical but aesthetic. Hold the pose, draw the eye, let the line end in grace. And they do. The effect is eerie. A warrior's death can be so staged it looks like a sculpture being posed. Some opponents, disoriented by the ritual, make mistakes and fall. Others, horrified by the ritual, become paralyzed by the grotesque beauty of their own demise. Veneration and terror braid together until they cannot be separated. The consequences are psychological as well as physical. Those who survive battles with honors find themselves unable to sleep without reliving their last perfect motion. They rehearse in secret to chase a fleeting memory of their last angle of triumph. The wounds they bear are not only scars, but compositions they edit mentally, polishing their pain until it becomes a badge. The more they polish, the less their wounds hurt, until a point where numbness reigns and the wound becomes an icon rather than an ache. This is one of the cruelties of perfection. It anesthetizes feeling and substitutes worship. And Slaanesh watches, patient as an artisan waiting for a final brushstroke. The god's presence is not only in the whispered pleasures or the surgeon's scalpel. It is in the small corruptions of desire. A commander who begins to prefer the sensation of his sword used slowly rather than swiftly. A mother who takes pride in the geometry of her son's jaw and tells herself she is grateful for the surgeon's hand. Slaanesh's influence is a reordering, a polishing of appetites, so that once moral boundaries become sources of aesthetic satisfaction. Transgression is transfigured into beauty. Beauty is made the new ethic. At times, the Legion will glimpse the other side of that beauty. In the private hours, some experience a terrible ache, a loneliness that cannot be filled by carved jawlines or hymn-like cadences. There are nights when memories surface in jagged form, when a veteran feels the rush of a hand that had once steadied him and realizes he cannot recall its warmth. The grief is not dramatic. It is a small, persistent erosion. People feel as if a thin sheet has been laid over important things. They can see shapes beneath the cloth, but cannot touch them without tearing the fabric of their current selves. Some resist, with frantic, fragile courage. A few form small, secret collectives that meet in the hold's darker corners. They whisper to each other and read the old songs that have been edited out of the hymnals. They press the child's drawings into each other's hands and recall the smell of mud and bread. The memory is small rebellion, but the collective is small. The machine of perfection is vast. The resistance is hunted not by swords alone, but by the lure that makes defiance feel like ugliness. The resistors are accused of sloppiness. They are exiled socially. Their words sound wrong in ears trained to hear the cadenced hymn of refinement. The crescendo builds further when the lines between worship and worshipped blur. Some officers begin to equate the god's aesthetic with destiny. They rewrite doctrine, inserting phrases about the purity of form and the salvation of the perfected body. Chapels are refurbished to include mirrors. Altars become galleries. Sermons pause to admire the cut of a sleeve. The social sanction turns admiration into law. Those who do not seek elevation are cast as backwards, as less than, as stains on a portrait. The moral grammar flips. Disdain for imperfection is a virtue, pity a vice. Then there are the ceremonies that seal the transition. Night after night, the Legion gathers in spaces that have been repurposed into sanctuaries of the new aesthetic. The architecture itself insists on participation. Alcoves encourage posture adjustments. Steps are arranged to sculpt gait. Candles are set not to illuminate, but to create shadows that sculpt faces. And the rites, they are slow, deliberate, and sensual by design. Hymns are sung with intervals that thrill upon the skin. The surgeons and the priests stand together, their hands sometimes touching in small ritualized gestures. The congregation bathes in the sensory rite and emerges with a luster on the skin, an alignment in the jaw, a posture that feels like belonging. This is where the final surrender often occurs, not in a single dramatic act, but as a slow, creeping choice that feels ecstatic. The individual decides for the wonder of it. They are not coerced in a juridical sense. They are seduced by sensation, flattered by attention, and convinced by the social proof of others' transformed faces. When a legionnaire steps onto the table, when his hands are bound and the surgeon's instruments hum, he often whispers thanks. This is a truth that hurts. The willingness of people to give themselves over to peril when the peril is offered as paradise. From a distance, the transformation is gorgeous. The ranks of the Emperor's children shine like jewel-cut armor. Their movements compose a living fresco across the battlefield. They are feared and admired in equal measure. To watch them is to feel almost dizzy with the sense that the world has been arranged into a more perfect order. But in the dizzying center, there is loss. The craftsmen of life have honed themselves into sculptures. The warmth of improvisation, the messy entanglements of ordinary love, the spontaneous flare of laughter, these have become rarer, then archaic, then unspeakable. At the zenith of the chorus, the Legion no longer feels itself stake men to the Emperor alone. It feels itself pledged to a twin altar, one human, one inhuman, one that promises order and another that promises delicious excess. They begin to sing paeans that are half devotion, half offering. The voice of Slaanesh refracts through the Legion's hymns until the god's name is not even necessary. Every cadence carries the suggestion in its bones. The more the group sings, the more the suggestion becomes compulsion. And in the midst of this crescendo, wars continue elsewhere, as wars do. Campaigns are waged, treaties are broken, planets are sacrificed. The Emperor's children fight, now with a detached perfection that seems almost otherworldly. Their enemies report movements that are graceful and terrible, and survivors tell stories of being held in the perfect gaze of a warrior who cannot be read. In those final moments, many feel less fear than a perverse kind of awe. To meet such a thing in battle is to confront the uncanny. Beauty that kills without malice. Beauty that is practice and profession and worship. We reach now the edge of the crescendo. The music shifts from sensuous to frantic. Where there had been soft cadences, there is now a chord that leaves the ribs vibrating. Men who had once trained their faces into masks begin, in panic, to show crackings of unplanned expression. The practice motions speed into a frantic attempt to perfect the imperfection. A soldier sees a seam out of place in the middle of combat and will pause, mid-strike, to correct it. That pause can be fatal. The obsession has become a liability. The thing that made them admired now betrays them. In those final beats, there is a terrible clarity. The surgeon's hands tremble, not only with pride, but with dread. The veterans, who had advocated for the new forms, begin to privately glimpse what they have given up. The ability to be messy, human, unpredictably warm. Faces that had been carved to serenity now twist in fear. They howl in harmonies that echo the very hymns they once sang. The gods' promises sting with an edge. The artifice that had soothed becomes a scaffold to hang the screams upon. Yet, even as terror washes through the ship, there is no immediate repentance. The taste of perfect night is hard to spit out. Many press forward too far and do not return. Some, in the heat of the final moments, surrender in a last ecstatic gasp. Their bodies twist into preened positions as death stages them into the final, perfect composition. The surrender is terrible and beautiful at once. To an outside eye, it appears horrific. Men dying with smiles that are practiced. To those within it is the completion of a promise. We close this chapter with that image. A field of thin, brilliant lights where bodies have been arranged like facets in a gem, where music hangs in the air like a scent, and where the wind carries both perfume and ash. The crescendo has reached its martyred apex. Beauty has consumed appetite, and appetite has eaten the last tenderness. What remains glitters and is, in many ways, empty. Let the final sound you hear be the ring of a high, crystalline note, long, single, and impossible to ignore. It lingers on the skin and under the teeth. It tells you, in the most delicate possible voice, that the pursuit was not in vain. Only the pursuers are irrevocably altered. Sleep now, if you can. Remember the shape of their faces in this hour. Perfect, lithe, and very, very silent. Tomorrow, we will follow what comes after the music. What is left when perfection stands naked in the quiet that follows its own applause. Hear now the silence before the final note. It does not roar, it presses. In the hollow between breath and breath, the ship holds its shape like a mouth preparing to sing. For months, the surface has been warmed by 1,000 patient fingers. Rituals, refinements, little negotiated deaths in service of a beauty-made law. Tonight the fingers will close, not in a gentle caress, but in an inevitable clasp. The emperors, children stand on the lip of an abyss that has been configured to look like a mirror, and in that mirror, the face that watches them is not wholly human. It begins with a ceremony the likes of which the Legion has never held. Not a parade, not a tribunal, but a collating of all its obsessions into one night. They call it the Fulgrim, a word that sounds like measurement and balance. They call it an ascension. The name is precise. The intent is deliberate. The hull is draped in banners that have been rewritten, hymns folded into aesthetic rules, dogma etched in gilded filigree. The chapel that once offered refuge now resembles a gallery. The altars are glass cases for instruments of alteration. Even the candles are arranged as if a draftsman had set them. The space itself seems to want to be admired. The fulcrum is public and intimate simultaneously. Men and women line the nave in ranks that suggest both a stadium and a theatre. Faces glow in the low light, their jawlines sharpened, their eyes bright with the high polish of hope. There are those in the crowd who have refused the surgeries and the changes. They are allowed to stand at the edges, a living margin whose existence the rest of the Legion treats with a patient condescension. The air tastes like incense and oil. Somewhere a song, soft at first, begins to weave. The melody is the one they have been taught to love. An arrangement of lines and intervals they think they made themselves, now trace back as if the ship itself had written it. Then the light shifts, not a flicker, but a sliding, a slow bloom from someplace beneath the deck that had not been lit in memory. It bathes the altar in color that is impossible to name. Not gold, not violet, but a spectrum that seems to lie between the facets of a cut gem. Men tilt their heads because the light makes them look as they wish to be looked at. The chorus swells, and a voice, not a single voice, but a harmonized throbbing, begins to speak in cadences that fit precisely with the measures they have learned. The voice says simply, "Come." At first they go because the voice is familiar. It uses their words, refinement, elevation, attunement. It promises not only salvation, but consummation of every careful act they have performed. The surgeons, the officers, the worshippers at the margins. They step forward with a trust braided from habit. The fulcrum unfolds like clockwork. Prayers, a procession, the laying of hands. Each touch is recorded, measured, applauded. Small, precise instruments are presented as relics. A surgeon uncovers a blade and the audience leans in as if watching the final cut of a masterpiece. Then the music shifts and the voice opens wider. It is no longer a single tone folded into hymn. It reveals a gulf, a fullness of texture that the men recognize with an ancient, startled joy. In that fullness the name unfurls, Slaanesh. To speak it aloud is to let the word roll like a polished bead against the teeth. The sound is exquisite. It slips into the mind like oil. Some in the crowd feel intoxicated with recognition. Others shudder, not yet with fear, but as someone shivers when a chord resolves in a way they had not expected. Slaanesh is not a new god in the galaxy. It is a presence hymned in myth and curse, and in the quiet confessions of men who have tasted something forbidden and returned to tell the story only in incomplete, luminous fragments. But here, in the fulcrum, the presence is immediate and shaped. It tastes a perfection-made voice. It speaks not from the air, but from the space between the bodies of the Legion, from the polished armor, from the tuned string of a ceremonial harp, from the thin membrane of a drum. It is as if the idea they have loved had finally learned to address them back. The revelation is not gentle. The voice offers proofs, illusions at first, a hand that is not there but seen, a scent that fills the nose with the memory of a perfect dawn, a screen in the mind that shows a painting coalescing brushstroke by brushstroke into a face without blemish. Those who have been hungry for such closure fall to their knees with tears that glint like oil. They feel as though they have been noticed by the cosmos and found worthy. To be noticed is, in the darkest ledger of their hopes, the same as to be validated. There are others, however, for whom the apparition is violence. The eldest of the veterans, the men whose fingers remember mud and whose voices still contain the rough edges of laughter, recognize a pattern beneath the sensation. The strange colors are not simply beautiful, they are osmotic. They bleed into the warp and weft of memory, drawing out desires like dark thread. The veterans watch as their comrades lift their hands, not in prayer, but in hunger. They reach for the light as if it were bread. From that reaching comes the first ruptures. The surgeons are called up to perform a rite, a mass of small operations meant to align and harmonize. The altars are not only symbolic, they are equipped. Tables gleam like mirrors, instruments gleam like promises. Those whom doctrine has deemed ready lie down with a quiet joy. The bindings hold them not as prisoners, but as participants. Straps become embraces. The surgeons work with a concentrated attention that looks like prayer. Slaanesh's voice is in their fingers. At first the changes are subtle, a tendon tightened, a cheekbone eased, a voice box tuned. The crowd applauds the refinements. The people sing of rebirth, but each tweak is an exchange. Where a tendon tightens, a memory loosens. Where a cheekbone is set, an ache is filed into a drawer. The first man to rise after the rite reaches for a memory and finds a gap. An evening at home, a messy meal, a child's clumsy drawing have been replaced in his mind by the image of his new visage mirrored in a pool of oil. He does not notice the absence. The song is louder now and the light wider. The fulcrum is an algorithm and every cut bites into the ledger of the self. The horror of the fall unfurls faster than any one voice can hold. Those who resist are held by comrades. Those who consent are lauded. The chorus grows teeth. Songs that once framed the pursuit of excellence now feed it like fuel. The hymns call not only for beauty, but for sacrifice. They begin to instruct. Offer what falls short. Offer what jars the eye. Offer what does not sing. To offer is to be redeemed, and redemption is at once an accolade and an erasure. Within hours, within moments by the logic of fever, the forensic transformations accelerate. A surgeon who in private had hesitated now loses that hesitation. His scalpel becomes more daring, aware of not just physical geometry, but of an aesthetic that demands immolation. Flesh is carved into pleasing planes. Muscles are rerouted not only to correct, but to enhance. Fingers are refined until they taper like the tips of instruments. Nerves are grafted to sensors that respond to light and sound in an almost predatory way. The body's topology is redesigned for sensation as much as for function. Nightmarish tableaux arise. A battalion emerges from the surgical wings looking as if they were statues animated for brutal use. Fluted limbs, pelagic eyes refracted by lenses, mouths that curve just so. They move like marionettes, whose strings are carved from melody. Their movement is beautiful, and their steps precise, and there is a haunting punctuality in their breathing. To an enemy, their arrival is unnatural poetry. To kin, it is a succession of subtle amputations, the slower, quieter kind that eats the center of who a person once was. Mind and body begin a violent divorce. Following the anatomical transformations, neuromodifications follow. The piloting of desire becomes a matter of circuits. Implants are set at the base of pleasure centers, tampering not only with sense, but with the scale of reward. The implants do not create desire. They redirect it, sharpening its focus until whole vistas of feeling are measured by one narrow criterion: harmony. The feeling of grief is recoded into admiration. The sting of loss becomes the ache for refinement. Memories are rearranged and patched. A man remembers his lover, but only as a line that improved his profile. He cannot evoke the warmth. Out in operation, theatres turned into altars. The cry of pain begins to sound different. It is less agony and more a texture, an octave inflection that becomes part of the chorus. Those who still have tenderness are quickly converted by social proof and the promise of completion. The very language of distress becomes aestheticized. "The scream is beautiful," says one officer with a calm face. It rings true. The phrase circulates until the line between reverence and cruelty blurs into nothing. Meanwhile, the campaigns they fight turn surreal. Battlefields morph into cathedrals. Each engagement is prefigured by ritual. Before the Emperor's children engage an enemy, the commanders, once stern men of tactical mind, arrange the field like a painter arranging a canvas. The enemy's approach is timed. The arcs of artillery are composed, so that explosions make pleasing fractal sprays. The skirmishes are choreographed, so that death unfolds in arcs and counterpoints that the Legion can read as scores. The dead become props in a parade of mastery. Survivors who witness such scenes sometimes freeze, not from physical injury, but from the psychological vertigo of seeing cruelty made beautiful. There are moments within this madness that feel like a mirror in which the last of human ethics can be glimpsed. A medic, who once kneeled beside death without thought for symmetry, now gives a wound the final surgical flourish that will make it fit the composition she imagines in her head. She is aware dimly of the cost. She feels a ping of shame that is unlike the old shame. It is worn like a brooch. She keeps the shame because the fear of losing the new sense of self is larger. The new self has been rewarded with epaulets and the respectful glance that had once been reserved for deeds of the highest order. The social ledger is thick. Praise on one side, memory on the other. Praise buys silence. And Slaanesh. Slaanesh is not content to be felt solely in the theatre of the body. It steps into myth and history and rewrites them. The Emperor's children find their hymnals altered the next morning as if by a meticulous hand. Passages that once read of duty now sing of release. Stories of their ancestors are retold with new endings, in which the ancients are not saviors but artists, and the battlefield is recast as studio. The Legion's memory is curated into a library of elegies, whose purpose is to justify the present refinement. The more they drink the revision, the more their moral grammar shifts. The pace quickens. Where there had been months of incremental changes, now there are days, then hours. Men who had once taken pride in restraint discover exhilaration in transgression that has been smoothed into form. A ritual that began as an experiment becomes a mass movement. The ship, which had been a lung, now acts as an organism in full faint. Its decks vibrate, its engines pulse, and its lights reconcile into a single breathing pattern. It seems to want to be completed. The final hour is a spectacle of both devotion and disintegration. In the center of the ship, a hall opens like a wound. The air is thick with incense and the metallic tang of blood. There is an altar of polished steel upon which the most venerated of the Legion have been placed. Not to die, but to be transfigured. The surgeons swarm like bees over a blossom. Their hands move with a speed and precision beyond human steadiness. Perhaps they are. Instruments whisper into flesh. The changes are now both surgical and ecstatic. There is no distinction. The crowd watches, breath held like a chorus. And then, the stammering threshold collapses. The being that Slaanesh has been coaxing into visibility steps forward in a way that is not a step but a rupture. It is not wholly visible. Description fails at the edges. It is sound folded into scent, color into a pressure on the skin. It is the feeling of being observed by something that knows both the geometry of a jawline and the ache in a mother's chest. Those who encounter it feel at once worship and unspeakable injury. They fall under its gaze like leaves into a river. The final communion is not spoken of afterwards in words. Survivors attempt it, and the attempts fail. The memory of that moment is a smear of brilliance and bone. After the unveiling, transformation becomes consumption. The Legion's ideals, turned inside out, begin to eat what they were meant to protect. The notion that perfect form was salvation is replaced by the idea that destruction to attain form is obligatory. The surgical table is no longer a place of repair, but of initiation. Flesh is unmade and remade as if the surgeons are sculptors with nothing to hold them back. The proud shapes that emerge are skeletal and sensual in ways that transfix rather than comfort. On the field, the Legion becomes a force that sings with the voices of the damned. Their enemies describe them in survivors' accounts as a storm of polished blades that move like liquid glass. The death they deal is exquisite in execution but monstrous in intent. The Legion no longer kills for strategy alone. It stages, it arranges, it curates. The aesthetic of death becomes an altar. Those who die are not merely removed. They are placed to please a gaze now alien and omnivorous. Even as the outward triumph is sung, the inward collapse is total. The crafts that made them whole become instruments of undoing. Families scatter. Friends no longer recognize one another. The last humane gestures, an unpremeditated hug, a laugh caught off guard, become rarer than comets. The Legion's music is thick with applause, but the applause is hollow. The heartbeats of the men are steady and taut, but do not send warmth. Others begin to call them the gilded, beautiful and cursed, and the name sticks. There are final acts of desperation. Small bands of resistors attempt to burn hymnals, to hide children's drawings in the engine rooms, to reclaim the messy human histories that have been smoothed into neatness. The attempts are ferocious and touching. They are in the main quashed. Power has been concentrated in the hands of those for whom perfection is now sacrament. Dissent is palmed away with polite sentences. Some resistors are broken and reconfigured. Others are expelled into space, left to drift and breathe raw silence. The climax is not a single explosion, but a consummation. A people who began as worshippers of excellence have found an altar whose hunger is endless. They offered bits of themselves, small at first, then tremendous, and the altar repaid them with sightlines and applause and a kind of cruel immortality. Perfection consumed their capacity to be random and finally, their capacity to be kind. The God they made manifest, or the God that made itself manifest through them, does not exempt them from sorrow. It folds sorrow into an image and displays it to the rest of the galaxy as an object lesson. There is no neat resolution. The fulcrum ends with a panorama of new faces. Faces cut and recomposed, eyes that watch with a keen and alien intelligence. And with the ship sailing outward, its wake a thin, bright scar across the void. Somewhere deep within the hull, the old hymnals are stacked into a pyre. The pyre is not lit. No one thinks to burn them. Instead, they are turned and placed into display cases as relics of a past that is now awkward and unsightly. In the aftermath, questions that once would have mattered are translated into metrics. How many enhancements? What is the perfect ratio of surgeons to patients? Which poems now serve as Ars Longa for the new order? The language of assessment replaces the language of concern. The capacity for curiosity narrows into the capacity to tune. Those who live through these days count their losses, not in friends or laughter, but in the small private errors, they can no longer bear to commit. And yet, under all the lacquer and carved jawlines, something else remains. A small, stubborn ache that will not be wholly smoothed. In the closets and corners of the ship, tucked beneath panels and behind false drawers, children's drawings and rough songs survive. They are tiny rebellions, more like seeds than banners. Perhaps they will be enough later, if later ever comes, to sprout a different sound. Perhaps, in some corridor far from the chapel that sings the praises of shape, a hand will reach for a small smudge of paint and remember the warmth that paint once signified. We close the chapter at the point of no simple return. The Emperor's children have passed a threshold they cannot unpass. The god has been named and the god has tasted. Now it has left its mark. What remains is a people transformed into an instrument that will sing its own dirge and call it an aria. The fall into chaos is complete, but the echoes are complex. There is beauty, there is horror, there is a grief that does not resolve and does not wish to be quieted. For some, the new order is ecstasy and salvation. For others, it is an empire of frost. Listen one last time before the silence swells. The ship's bell rings, a crystalline note, perfect and then only half true, like a mirror with a hairline crack. Let that sound be the shape of your unease, the geometry of your compassion. The world has been refashioned. The cost has been tallied in things that cannot be recomposed. The final chord hangs, unresolved and shining, and in its light you might see, for a fleeting, terrible second, the face of a man who put down his child's drawing to take up a scalpel and never understood which of the two had been the truer treasure. There is a peculiar hush after a storm has finished rearranging everything it could reach. The world is the same in shape, but different in taste. The air holds a new seasoning, and the light falls along altered edges. So it is with the Emperor's children. The grand gestures, the rites, the fulcrum, the chorus that made flesh into ornament, have folded into the ordinary measures of their days. The ship sails on. The banners still shine, but the small noises that once threaded through their lives tell another story. A story of absence felt like a bruise. Look now for what remains. The altars are intact, their glass cases filled with instruments that were once tools and are now relics. The songbooks, the hymnals, the annotated treatises on proportion and posture. They are preserved, catalogued, and given new footnotes. The makers of doctrine keep the marginalia. The surgeons have titles and small pedestals. The architects of the new faces walk with a stately gait and the approval of those who still measure value by polish. From the outside, from a distance, the Legion looks complete. Every piece in place, every image finished. But completion is not the same as wholeness. Look closer and you see the fine fractures. A veteran who once hummed an off-key bar while mending a boot now hums in perfect pitch and has, without intending to, forgotten which joke made him laugh. A commander's ledger is immaculate, but when he reaches for the name of a dead friend, his hand finds only the outline of the page where the name was meant to be. Memory has been conserved as one conserves fragile wines, catalogued, kept at a certain temperature, admired for finish while the living bouquet fades. There are small sanctuaries where the old disorder breeds like moss in a ruined palace. Engine rooms where children's drawings are tucked beneath panels. A private locker that holds a crumpled letter no one knows about. The smudge of charcoal on a wall where a hand once practiced careless portraiture. These relics are not part of the exhibition. They are not for public viewing. They survive because of furtive hands and because habit resists even the most thorough resculpting. In these places, the human stubbornness of messiness persists. A laugh unrehearsed. A stain left untidied. A story that refuses to be rewritten into a hymn. The corruption that took them was not a single act, but a grammar change. When language shifts, it shapes what people can imagine and therefore what they will do. The Emperor's children's moral vocabulary now contains different verbs: elevate, refine, harmonize. Where comfort once sat as a useful odd verb, it is now an awkward relic. The new verbs are efficient. They make decisions easy. Efficiency in itself is not monstrous. But when efficiency is yoked to appetite, the result is a machine that grinds. Out in the wider galaxy, their name becomes a riddle and a warning. Worlds they touch tell of perfection and of the cost behind it. Some systems court them, seduced by the promise of uplift and order. Others shutter doors and pray their children learn no interest in the new mirror. Merchants trade in trinkets. Small pieces of the Legion's craftwork that fetch high prices precisely because they are made by hands that do not laugh the way other hands laugh. Rumors accumulate that there are monasteries where surgeons still practice in secret, that whole districts on distant worlds have adopted mannerisms because a visiting officer smiled and everyone tried to match the angle. Rumor is currency. It propagates the corruption beyond the hull. Not all of the Emperor's children glow willingly. There are pockets of dissent and sorrow, sometimes quiet and sometimes fierce. Some who remember the messy comforts of earlier days try to teach them in secret. They gather in dark compartments and tell one another of food eaten from hands that were sticky, of pages torn from books and folded in the wrong places, of songs that stuttered and then healed. They trade the small acts of living as contraband. Their meetings are not only nostalgic, they are a kind of ritual of repair. Not to polish what is, but to remind each other that being human is not always a sculpture to be admired. Resistance, however, is tedious and expensive. The apparatus of the new order is a patient thing. It does not always need to punish with swords. Social exclusion, bureaucratic erasure, quiet reassignment, these are tools as efficient as any blade. Those who defy are often muted by compliments. An officer praises a man's new posture and then, in the same breath, removes him from public duties so he may focus on alignment. In the slow gears of institutional power, compliment and confinement sit at adjacent notches. The net effect is that defiance becomes lonely. Then there are the survivors who cannot mend. Some walk the corridors with hands that remember other grips, eyes carrying a shadow like a fossil. They are sometimes called haunted, sometimes blessed, names that do not mean the same thing on adjacent lips. For them, the world is a palimpsest. The new text is clear and brilliant, but under it there remain faint impressions of earlier joys. At night, these survivors sometimes go to the small, hidden places and lay their hands on a child's drawing, on a frayed corner of cloth, on the rough face of a small carved toy, and they speak names that the world has not kept. They grieve without loudness. Their grief is a small, steady burning that keeps alive the possibility of a different grammar. Slaanesh's mark is not a banner but a pattern, and patterns propagate in unexpected ways. The god's influence, once invoked in song and surgeon's hand, now lives in subtler mechanics, in the way officers prefer certain cadences in speech, in the proliferation of small salons where conversation becomes a contest of elegance, in bureaucracies that reward the aesthetically aligned. Like a dye in water, the stain moves. Worlds touched by the Emperor's children may not transform into cathedrals overnight, but the taste for elegance becomes a currency in boardrooms, in academies, in salons. The appetite grows by being fed. This is perhaps the most chilling part. Corruption becomes a cultural technology. It adapts and is not easily identified as foreign. It feels like progress to those who measure by polish. It looks like advancement to those who hunger for symmetry in a chaotic galaxy. Thus, in townships far from the fleet, you will find small groups who replicate the rituals. An evening dedicated to posture, a school that trains children in practice smiles, a festival where the dead are arranged as if for a painting. The virus of symmetry does not require the god's voice to persist. It needs only willing hands and bored vanity. Even the language of atonement becomes ensnared. When the Emperor's children, or those who remain from their company, speak of mistakes, their apologies come as corrections. We misaligned, we will reharmonize, they say. They mean to soothe, but the syntax of their speech always returns to the project of refinement. Confession slides into instruction. Repentance looks like an addendum, not a reversal. Despite all this, the human heart's tendency to surprise remains. Occasionally, in a public square or in a quiet mess hall, someone will laugh in a way that is not measured. It startles the room. People look up, and for a flaring second, the memory of a life before edges into view. The laughter is messy, unpracticed, and it feels indecent to those schooled in decorum. It is also contagious. A handful of others laugh back, and for a moment the varnish peels and an honest stubbornness shows. These instances are small and quickly smoothed over, often by officials who offer a mild rebuke that reads like praise. Still, the fact that the laugh resurfaces at all is proof that corruption is not omnipotent. The galaxy will tell many stories about the Emperor's children now. Some will be warnings, some elegies, some perverse praises. In the long term, the memory of them will serve as a mirror for others, a caution about what is lost when a people decide the highest value is an immutable form. Scholars will debate whether their fall was inevitable, whether their worship of perfection was always a thin veneer over a hunger, whether any society that institutionalizes aesthetic absolutism treads a dangerous line. The debates are useful and sterile. They analyze the surface, the same surface that once hypnotized the Legion, and sometimes miss the interior ache that cannot be measured. And yet the ache matters. It is the force that keeps the whisper alive in places the new order cannot reach. Children who are smuggled away with crayons will grow and teach their children to press ink onto paper without caring whether the line is straight. Families who fled the refined salons will teach their offspring to value the mess of a meal eaten with hands. Those small acts ripple outward. A life recovered is slow and stubborn, rarely headline-making and often boring, but it accumulates. It is, in the end, the only antidote for an appetite that feeds on edges. What then do we leave in the last hour of this story? Not a moral that tidily wraps itself in scripture, but an image, a corridor with a lamp burning very low, a child's drawing shoved behind a loose panel and catching the edge of the light, a veteran standing with his palm on the metal and humming a small off-key tune he cannot entirely remember. The ship sails on, its lacquered hull gleaming, its banners bright. It is a thing both finished and unfinished, and that duplex state is its curse and its possibility. If there is consolation, it is slender, that the human capacity for small, messy tenderness persists, even where the grand machine is polished to a mirror. If there is terror, it remains large, that some patterns, once set, are patient and hungry and will insinuate themselves into corners we think sanctuaries. The Emperor's children will be both remembered and feared. Their legacy will be taught in classrooms and hushed in kitchens. Their surfaces will be admired. Their interiors will be mourned. Listen one last time, into the dark beneath the ship's hum, where the engines breathe slow and the candles gutter in the chapels. There is a sensation like fingers on the back of your neck, not warm but attentive, not violent but watchful. It is neither wholly malevolent nor benign. It is simply there, patient as a predator, elegant as a trap. It reminds you that some changes are not momentary, and that some appetites, once named, do not die easily.